In the wake of Alabama's loss to Oklahoma, a double standard emerged. The Tide's defeat was dismissed as bad luck, but when they won the Iron Bowl 2 weeks later with nearly identical metrics, nobody called that a fluke. Today we're looking at why Oklahoma is facing more than just a team. They are tasked with dismantling the Alabama brand narrative. It's a mystique birthed by the greatest coach of all time, strong enough to shield them from consequences even after a blowout loss in the SEC title game. You'll want to watch this one all the way through because I'm going to show you exactly why the Sooners' victory wasn't an accident. But before we go further, big shout out to you all for subbing to the channel. You exceeded my expectations. Let's keep it going. Please like, subscribe, and share this content with others if you want more of it.
Welcome to Sooner Stats, your home for Oklahoma Sooners coverage.
The 2025 college football season will largely be remembered by future historians of the sport, not merely for the games played on the field, but for the stark, almost blinding illumination of the mechanisms used to construct, maintain, and defend the narratives of blue blood programs. The interplay between the Oklahoma Sooners and the Alabama Crimson Tide, spanning a regular season upset in Tuscaloosa, a contentious Iron Bowl survival, and a controversial college football playoff selection process, served as a crucible for examining the biases inherent in modern sports journalism and governance. The implications of this analysis extend beyond the specific teams involved. They touch upon the very integrity of the sport's postseason apparatus, raising fundamental questions about the role of brand versus resume, the weaponization of advanced analytics to enforce the status quo, and the economic imperatives that drive the Alabama necessity doctrine in college. To fully grasp the magnitude of the media reaction to the November game, one must first map the narrative terrain that existed prior to kickoff and how the event dismantled the pregame script. The perception of both programs was not merely a reflection of their win-loss records, but a product of historical momentum and brand equity. Entering mid-November, the Alabama Crimson Tide, ranked number 4, was viewed not just as a contender, but as a structural necessity to the college football playoff. Under second-year head coach Kalen DeBoer, the program was perceived to have navigated the post-Saban transition with resilience. The media coverage surrounding Alabama focused heavily on the standard, treating the Week 1 loss to Florida State as a mulligan, or Week 1 aberration, that could be discarded in the face of subsequent successes against SEC opponents. Analysts perpetuated the idea that Alabama controlled its own destiny, invoking the eye test, a subjective metric often used to bolster blue blood programs, to argue that Alabama's ceiling was higher than that of its peers. The prevailing sentiment was that Alabama had stabilized the ship and was on a collision course with Georgia for the SEC title, a narrative that required a victory over Oklahoma as a prerequisite. Conversely, the Oklahoma Sooners entered the contest ranked number 11, but plagued by skepticism. The narrative surrounding Oklahoma in their second SEC season was one of survival rather than dominance. Despite a 7-2 record, the media focus remained fixated on their offensive struggles and the steep learning curve of the new quarterback and offensive coordinator. The doormat narrative had been pervasive in the midseason, particularly after a loss to Texas. Although the Sooners had rebounded, the national media largely viewed them as a high-floor, low-ceiling team, capable of beating mid-tier opponents but designed to be fodder for the league's elite. Thus, the November 15th game was framed not as a clash of titans, but as a coronation for Alabama's playoff resume and a reality check for Oklahoma's SEC ambitions. The box score of the game became the primary battlefield for narrative supremacy. It presented a dichotomy that allowed biased observers to claim that the better team lost, fueling a disconnect between the result on the field and the result in the court of public opinion. The disparity in total yardage became the foundational pillar of the Fluke narrative. In a neutral analysis, yardage is a means to an end. However, in the post-game coverage, Alabama media elevated yardage to a moral victory. The argument was that process, or gaining yards, is more indicative of quality than results, or scoring points, provided the discrepancy can be blamed on variance like turnovers. The perspective assumes that moving the ball between the 20-yard lines is the true measure of football skill, while the inability to protect the ball or finish drives in the red zone is merely a statistical glitch rather than a fundamental deficiency. The most sophisticated attempt to delegitimize the loss came from the application of advanced analytics. Bama Hammer and other outlets published analyses arguing that Alabama had a 95% post-game win expectancy, based on the yardage and efficiency data. This statistic is derived from models that calculate the likelihood of winning based on down, distance, and field position of every play. Because Alabama moved the ball effectively between the 20-yard lines, the model viewed them as the dominant team. However, the model, and the journalists citing it, failed to account for the non-random nature of Oklahoma's defense. The reliance on this metric represents a box score scout mentality that refuses to accept the result absolutist reality. By treating the result as a 1 in 20 statistical anomaly, the media effectively argued that, in a fair universe simulated by a computer, Alabama wins. Therefore, the actual result should be disregarded when evaluating the true strength of the teams. This reduction of elite defensive play to randomness is a critical tool in narrative warfare, erasing the stylistic clash where Oklahoma intentionally traded yardage for high-leverage turnover opportunities. It suggests that turnovers are purely luck-based events, ignoring the specific techniques, strip attempts, jumping routes, confusing coverage, employed by the defense to generate those outcomes. In the immediate reaction, a linguistic pattern emerged that stripped the Oklahoma defense of agency. Alabama-centric reports described the game-deciding plays using passive or reflexive language. Alabama turned it over, type Simpson gave it away, or mistakes were made. This attributional bias is common in coverage of favored teams. Their failures are internal, while their successes are internal. By framing these game-deciding plays as errors by the offense rather than plays by the defense, the media preserved the hierarchy. If Alabama gave the game away, they're still superior. They just lack discipline. This allows for optimism going forward, rather than a systemic reevaluation of the team's ability to match up with physical defenses. National pundits focused on minimizing the consequences of the loss. Paul Finebaum, often the bellwether for SEC sentiment, executed a pivot in real time. Initially labeling the loss as inexcusable, he quickly transitioned to a narrative of reassurance, arguing it doesn't feel that bad because Alabama was still in reasonably good shape for the playoff. This statement reveals the circular logic of the college football playoff era. Alabama is an elite team. Elite teams make the playoffs. Therefore, if Alabama loses, it must not be a bad loss because they're still going to make the playoffs. Finebaum's commentary stripped the game of its emotional stakes. If a historic home loss to a conference rival doesn't feel that bad, it is because the media has predetermined that the loser is too big to fail. This sentiment was echoed by Joel Klatt, who, despite criticizing Alabama's one-dimensional offense, framed the game as a referendum on Alabama's flaws rather than Oklahoma's strengths, reinforcing the protagonist-centric view of the Crimson Tide. The bias in media narrative construction becomes undeniable when contrasting the reaction to Oklahoma's win over Alabama with the reaction to Alabama's win over Auburn just 2 weeks later. The 2025 Iron Bowl featured strikingly similar statistical anomalies to the OU-Alabama game, yet the media interpretation was inverted. This comparison serves as a control group for the statistical anomaly argument. If stats dictate the narrative, both games should have been treated as flukes. They were not. The build-up to the Iron Bowl was dominated by the metaphor of Jordan-Hare Stadium as a haunted house, a term explicitly used by Nick Saban. This framing served to lower the bar for Alabama's aesthetic performance while raising the stakes for the result. A win, no matter how ugly, would be treated as an exorcism. A loss would be treated as an inevitability of the venue's curse. The venue itself became an active participant in the narrative, excusing Alabama's struggles in Auburn while delegitimizing Oklahoma's success in Tuscaloosa. In the Iron Bowl, Auburn outgained Alabama 411 to 280. Auburn quarterback Ashton Daniels had more total yards than the entire Alabama team combined. Yet the post-game narrative for Alabama was not, they got lucky to win despite being outplayed. Instead, it was framed as a survival test. When Oklahoma was outgained by Alabama, but won via turnovers, the narrative was statistical fluke, 95% win expectancy for the loser. When Alabama was outgained by Auburn, but won via turnovers and a controversial call, the narrative was championship DNA, finding a way to win. When Alabama struggles but wins, It is evidence of their intangible greatness. When Oklahoma struggles but wins, it is evidence of luck that cannot be repeated. The narrative construction actively works to protect the status of Alabama, ensuring that their bad days are character-building exercises rather than exposés of weakness. What advanced metrics and most national analysts don't take into account is the historical performances between these two programs and how a similar blueprint is revealed. The Oklahoma blueprint versus Alabama is centered around three pillars: turnover margin, defensive scoring, and yard efficiency. Looking at turnover margin domination, consistently, Oklahoma is achieving a +2 or +3 turnover margin against Alabama, looking back at 2003, 2014, 2024, and 2025. This is not random. It is a result of Havoc rate, a metric that tracks tackles for losses, passes defended, and forced fumbles. Oklahoma's defense is designed to maximize this rate. Next, defensive scoring. Oklahoma's used to bypassing offensive struggles to score directly via defense. Looking at Eric Bassey in 2002, Geno Grissom in 2014, Eli Bowen in 2025. Lastly, yardage efficiency. Scoring more points with fewer yards by shortening the field. In 2025, OU's points per yard was double that of Alabama's. The consistent ability to outperform the betting spread by massive margins proves that the market and media models systematically undervalue the impact of Oklahoma's turnover-centric defense against Alabama's efficiency-based offense. One of the best arguments for this game not being a fluke for Oklahoma is how they ended up winning the last 4 games of the season. Beating Tennessee, Alabama, Missouri, and LSU, OU lost the total yardage battle in 3/4 of those games, but won turnover margin in 3/4, with 2 of those games ending with defensive scores. A fluke by definition is not something repeatable, bolstering the argument that Oklahoma's way of winning is sustainable. The fluke narrative established in the wake of the Oklahoma loss served a vital administrative purpose. It delegitimized the loss as a data point. By categorizing the defeat as a statistical anomaly or a self-inflicted wound, the media effectively placed the game in a quarantine zone. It became an event that happened, but one that shouldn't count. This paved the way for the buffer strategy. Because the loss to Oklahoma was deemed unlucky rather than structural, the committee felt emboldened to artificially inflate Alabama's ranking heading into the SEC championship. Thus, the spin that began with denying Oklahoma credit in November became the direct mechanism for justifying keeping them at 9. The narrative didn't just excuse a loss, it built a firewall. The statistical anomaly of this decision cannot be overstated, breaking nearly a decade of precedent. Alabama became the first team in the CFP era to suffer a double-digit loss in a conference championship game and not drop a single spot in the subsequent ranking. The committee's refusal to penalize the loss effectively severed the correlation between late-season performance and ranking consequences, a protection never afforded to teams not named Alabama. The coverage of the 2025 Oklahoma-Alabama series and the subsequent playoff selection reveals a deep-seated resistance to change within the college football establishment. The good loss economy protects SEC prestige by framing defeats for teams like Alabama as anomalies rather than failures, ensuring their status and the conference's value remains intact. This narrative is reinforced by the weaponization of analytics, where metrics like win probability are used to dismiss actual upsets as statistical flukes, prioritizing computer models over on-field results. Ultimately, this creates a closed logic loop that insulates favored programs from the consequences of losing, asking fans to believe the simulation rather than the scoreboard. Beyond the statistics and the rankings lies a more metaphysical conflict. Oklahoma was not merely fighting the 2025 Alabama Crimson Tide, but the idea of Alabama. The college football ecosystem is currently suffering from a collective Saban hangover, a cognitive inertia where the glory years of Nick Saban are superimposed onto the present reality. The media coverage reveals a desperate clinging to the standard of the past, treating the program as a monolith that cannot waver, even when the on-field product clearly has. Analysts discuss Alabama with a reverence reserved for the dynastic years, creating an aura of invincibility that no longer aligns with the tape. When Oklahoma defeated Alabama, they didn't just win a football game. They pierced this veil of legacy. The chaos blueprint is effective specifically because it ignores the aura. While the media and the committee are paralyzed by the memory of what Alabama used to be, Oklahoma attacks the reality of what they know they are. A team susceptible to pressure, confusion, and variance. The resistance to giving Oklahoma credit is, at its core, a resistance to letting go of the Saban era. To admit Oklahoma was the better team is to admit that the king is gone, and the media is not ready to mourn. Do you think Oklahoma can beat Alabama and break their brand? Will Alabama's narrative change if they lose to Oklahoma? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you're still watching this, thank you for watching till the end. If you'd like to further support the channel, you can currently become a member for just 99 cents and have access to a college football playoff dashboard I built myself. You can compare teams, look at trends, and it even offers you a doppelganger of the team that you've selected. Let me know if you'd be interested in building out more tools like this moving forward. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Boomer.